There's something uniquely terrifying about nature turning against us in ways we never anticipated. We build our cities, design our infrastructure, and plan our lives based on historical weather patterns, trusting that the climate we've always known will continue to protect us. But in recent years, that trust has become a dangerous assumption, as extreme weather events shatter records and exceed every projection our models predicted. During my investigations into unexplained phenomena, I've discovered that some of the most heartbreaking premonitions involve climate disasters that our systems are simply not prepared to handle. Perhaps it's the helplessness we feel when confronting forces beyond human control. Perhaps it's the way extreme weather exposes the fragility of the civilizations we've built. Or perhaps our changing climate is generating threats so unprecedented that only our deepest intuitive warnings can detect them before they strike. Today I share two accounts from individuals who experienced premonitions about weather events that defied all reasonable expectations. Both foresaw climate disasters that would overwhelm the safety systems their communities had trusted for generations. Both tried desperately to warn others about dangers that seemed impossible until they became inevitable. The first comes from Dr. Elena Rossi, a geriatrician working in Milan during what meteorologists predicted would be a typical European summer. Second, from James McKenzie, a lifelong resident of Fargo, North Dakota, who understood cold weather better than anyone, but still couldn't prepare his city for what was coming. These testimonies were recorded months after their experiences, in quiet offices where the weight of knowledge about preventable disasters still lingers. Both individuals continue to work in their respective fields, but both carry the burden of having seen catastrophes that our infrastructure and emergency systems were powerless to prevent. What makes their stories particularly devastating is how their premonitions revealed not just the power of extreme weather, but the inadequacy of our preparations for climate events that fall outside historical norms. The very systems we depend on for safety become deadly vulnerabilities when nature exceeds the parameters they were designed to handle. Listen to these accounts and consider, as our climate becomes increasingly unpredictable, are we still planning for the weather we remember rather than the weather we should expect? When our infrastructure fails in the face of unprecedented conditions, how many people will pay the price for our collective failure to imagine the unimaginable? Story 1. The doctor's warning account of Dr. Elena Rossi, 52 years old, geriatrician. My name is Dr. Elena Rossi, and I've spent 28 years caring for elderly patients in Milan. I understand how heat affects aging bodies, how quickly dehydration can turn fatal for people over 70, and how vulnerable our most fragile citizens become when temperatures rise beyond normal ranges. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for the summer when I saw death approaching with mathematical precision and found myself powerless to prevent it. The premonition came to me during the first week of June, when meteorologists were predicting a warm but manageable summer for northern Italy. Temperatures were expected to reach the high 20s Celsius, warm by Milan standards, but well within the range our healthcare system and social services were designed to handle. I was conducting my weekly rounds at Villa Serena, a private nursing home that housed 84 residents between the ages of 72 and 96. Villa Serena was considered one of the finest elder care facilities in Milan. Modern building, excellent air conditioning, professional medical staff, and emergency protocols that exceeded national safety standards. But as I moved through the facility that morning, checking on patients and reviewing treatment plans, I suddenly saw something that wasn't happening yet. I was in the common room, discussing medication adjustments with Mrs. Benedetti, when I suddenly found myself standing in the same room during what appeared to be a different time of day. The sunlight streaming through the windows was harsh and white, the kind of light that comes with extreme heat. The air conditioning was running, but it wasn't working properly. I could hear the system straining and cycling irregularly. In this vision, Mrs. Benedetti wasn't sitting comfortably in her usual chair. She was lying on the floor, unconscious, with skin that looked gray and dry like parchment. Around the room, other residents were in similar conditions. Some collapsed, others sitting but unresponsive, all showing signs of severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. But what terrified me most was the temperature reading on the wall display, 47 degrees Celsius, nearly 117 degrees Fahrenheit. a temperature that had never been recorded in Milan, a temperature that would overwhelm any air conditioning system not designed for desert conditions. The vision lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like hours. When I returned to the present, Mrs. Benedetti was looking at me with concern. "Dottoressa, are you feeling well? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't tell her I'd seen something worse. I'd seen her death, and the deaths of dozens of other residents, from heat that shouldn't be possible in northern Italy. For the next 3 days, I couldn't shake the image of that overheated common room. I researched historical weather records for Milan, consulted with meteorologists, and reviewed medical literature about heat-related mortality in elderly populations. What I found was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because temperatures of 47 degrees Celsius were virtually impossible in Milan's climate zone. Terrifying because elderly people could start dying from heat exhaustion at temperatures far below what I'd seen in my vision. If Milan experienced even 38-39 degrees Celsius for an extended period, people would start dying. At 42-43 degrees, the death toll would be catastrophic. At 47 degrees, it would be genocide by weather. I called a meeting with the Villa Serena administration to discuss enhanced heat emergency protocols. "Dr. Rossi," said the facility director, "we appreciate your concern, but our air conditioning systems are rated for temperatures up to 40 degrees Celsius. That's well above any weather Milan has ever experienced. But what if temperatures exceed 40 degrees? That's not meteorologically possible in this region. Our engineers consulted with climate experts when designing the cooling systems. But what if it happens anyway?" The director looked at me with the patience administrators, reserved for medical staff they think are overreacting. "Dr. Rossi, we have emergency protocols for every reasonable weather scenario. We can't design systems for impossible conditions." But I knew those impossible conditions were coming. I could see them as clearly as I could see the concerned faces around the conference table. Over the next week, I tried to prepare for a heat emergency that no one else believed was possible. I researched portable cooling units, emergency hydration, protocols and evacuation procedures for elderly patients during extreme weather events. But there was only so much I could do without institutional support. Villa Serena's administration wasn't going to invest in expensive emergency equipment for weather conditions that had never occurred in Milan's recorded history. The heat wave began on June 18th with temperatures reaching 32 degrees Celsius, warm but within normal summer ranges. The weather service predicted the heat would continue for several days, possibly reaching 36 to 37 degrees at its peak. But by June 20th, temperatures had reached 39 degrees Celsius, and the city's infrastructure was already showing strain. Power grids were overloaded by air conditioning demand, and hospitals were reporting increased admissions for heat-related illnesses. Villa Serena's air conditioning was working, but I could see the signs that I'd witnessed in my vision. The system was cycling more frequently, struggling to
maintain comfortable temperatures, using more power than it was designed to consume. On June 21st, Milan recorded its highest temperature in recorded history, 42 degrees Celsius. The city's power grid, overloaded by unprecedented air conditioning demand, began experiencing rolling blackouts. Villa Serena lost power for 47 minutes during the hottest part of the afternoon, and when power was restored, the air conditioning system couldn't catch up with the heat that had built up
in the building. That's when I knew my vision was becoming reality. I immediately called for emergency medical support and began implementing heat emergency protocols that I'd developed in secret over the previous weeks. We moved all residents to the lowest floor of the building, set up cooling stations with wet towels and ice packs, and began aggressive hydration procedures. But it wasn't enough. On June 22nd, temperatures reached 44 degrees Celsius. Villa Serena's air conditioning system, designed for maximum temperatures of 40 degrees, simply couldn't function in conditions that exceeded its engineering specifications. Mrs. Benedetti was the first to collapse. I found her in the common room at 3:17 p.m., unconscious on the floor in exactly the position I'd seen in my vision 3 weeks earlier. Her core body temperature was 41.2 degrees Celsius, a level that causes permanent organ damage in elderly patients. Over the next 6 hours, 14 more residents collapsed from heat exhaustion. We called emergency services, But the city's ambulance system was overwhelmed by heat-related emergencies throughout Milan. Hospitals were operating over capacity, and air conditioning failures were being reported at facilities across the city. I worked frantically to cool and hydrate patients using every technique I knew, but I was fighting physiology that had reached catastrophic levels. When an 89-year-old woman's body temperature exceeds 42 degrees Celsius, her organs begin shutting down in ways that medicine cannot reverse. By midnight on June 22nd, 7 residents of Villa Serena had died from hypothermia. Mrs. Benedetti survived, but with kidney damage that would require dialysis for the rest of her life. 8 other residents suffered organ damage that significantly shortened their life expectancy. On June 23rd, temperatures reached 47 degrees Celsius, exactly what I'd seen in my vision. Milan's infrastructure collapsed completely. Power grids failed throughout the city. Water pressure dropped as demand exceeded supply capacity, and emergency services were paralyzed by the sheer volume of heat-related emergencies. The final death toll from the Milan heat dome was 847 people, mostly elderly residents of care facilities that had been designed for a climate that no longer existed. Villa Serena lost 12 residents over 4 days, not because of medical negligence or system failures, but because we had built our infrastructure for weather conditions that climate change had made obsolete. The investigation that followed praised Villa Serena's emergency response and noted that our mortality rate was actually lower than many other facilities during the heat emergency. But that didn't change the fact that I had seen this disaster coming and been unable to prevent it. The European Union has since mandated that all elder care facilities install cooling systems designed for temperatures up to 50 degrees Celsius. Building codes have been updated to require emergency backup cooling systems. Heat emergency protocols now include mandatory evacuation procedures for vulnerable populations. But those changes came too late for Mrs. Benedetti's kidneys, too late for the 12 residents who died at Villa Serena, and too late for the 847 people who died in Milan during 4 days when the weather exceeded every assumption our civilization had made about what was possible. Since the heat dome, I've had 3 more visions of extreme weather events: flooding that would overwhelm Milan's drainage systems, windstorms that would topple buildings not designed for hurricane-force gusts, and hail that would shatter windows throughout the city. Each time I've tried to warn the appropriate authorities. Each time I've been told that such events are not meteorologically possible in northern Italy. But I've learned that meteorologically possible is a moving target in an era of climate change. The weather we're getting is not the weather our infrastructure was designed for, and the gap between those two realities is measured in human lives. I continue to work in geriatric medicine, but now I spend as much time preparing for impossible weather as I do treating routine medical conditions, because I know that in our new climate reality, impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet. The most heartbreaking part of my experience isn't that I failed to save those 12 residents. It's that I knew exactly what was going to happen and found myself trapped in systems that couldn't adapt quickly enough to prevent tragedies that were entirely predictable. Sometimes having a premonition isn't about being able to prevent disaster. Sometimes it's about bearing witness to the moment when our assumptions about safety and security prove to be fatally inadequate. Have you ever known that a disaster was approaching but found yourself powerless to convince others to prepare for something that had never happened before? Have you ever watched infrastructure fail in ways that killed people who trusted that infrastructure to protect them? Dr. Rossi's experience reveals how extreme heat can overwhelm systems we've trusted for generations, turning places of safety into death traps when temperatures exceed engineering specifications. But what happens when the opposite extreme strikes with equal force? What happens when cold weather exceeds every assumption we've made about winter survival in regions that have experienced harsh winters for centuries? Story 2. The Cold Weather Veteran's Vision. Account of James McKenzie, 46 years old, municipal utilities supervisor. My name is James McKenzie, and I've lived in Fargo, North Dakota, for my entire life. I've seen temperatures drop to -30, -40, even -50 degrees Fahrenheit. I understand cold weather the way desert dwellers understand heat. It's not just weather to me, it's a fundamental aspect of existence that shapes how we build, how we live, and how we survive. But nothing in 46 years of North Dakota winters prepared me for the cold that came in February, or for the premonition that showed me exactly how our city would break when temperatures dropped beyond the limits of human engineering. The vision came to me during a routine inspection of the city's water distribution system. As municipal utilities supervisor, I was responsible for maintaining the infrastructure that kept 125,000 people supplied with water, heat, and power through some of the harshest winters in North America. FARGO's utilities were built for extreme cold. Our water mains were buried 8 feet underground, below the frost line that had remained constant for over a century. Our buildings were constructed with insulation rated for temperatures down to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Our power systems included backup generators and redundant heating systems designed to function in any weather conditions North Dakota had ever experienced. We were prepared for the kind of cold that kills people who aren't careful. We weren't prepared for the kind of cold that kills cities. I was examining pressure readings in our main pumping station when I suddenly found myself standing in the same facility during what appeared to be a different season. The digital thermometer on the wall read -68 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that had never been recorded in North Dakota, a temperature that existed only in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. But this wasn't the most disturbing part of the vision. What terrified me was watching the infrastructure around me fail in ways I'd never imagined possible. The water mains, buried 8 feet underground below what we thought was a permanent frost line, were freezing solid, not just slowing down or developing ice blockages, freezing completely, turning into solid ice pipes that expanded until they burst underground, creating massive water breaks that couldn't be repaired in subarctic conditions. The natural gas lines, designed to operate in extreme cold but not polar conditions, were losing pressure as the gas itself approached its freezing point. Heating systems throughout the city were failing not because of power outages, but because the fuel they depended on was literally too cold to burn efficiently. Most horrifying, I could see the electrical grid failing as metal transmission lines contracted beyond their design tolerances, snapping under stresses that engineers had never calculated for because they'd never expected such temperatures in this latitude. In the vision, FARGO was dying from cold that exceeded every assumption we'd made about what winter could do to a modern city. When I returned to the present, I was standing in the warm pumping station, staring at temperature readings that showed a manageable -15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold, but routine for February in North Dakota. For the next week, I couldn't shake the image of frozen water mains and snapping power lines. I researched historical weather records for the northern plains, consulted with meteorologists, and reviewed engineering specifications for cold weather infrastructure. What I discovered was unsettling. FARGO's infrastructure was designed for extreme cold by North Dakota standards, but extreme was defined by historical weather patterns that might no longer be relevant. Climate change wasn't just making some places hotter, it was making other places colder through disruptions in atmospheric circulation patterns. The polar vortex, a circulation pattern that normally kept Arctic air confined to polar regions, was becoming unstable and occasionally delivering truly Arctic conditions to areas that had never experienced them. I called a meeting with the mayor and city engineering department to discuss enhanced cold weather emergency protocols. "Jim," said the mayor, "our infrastructure is rated for temperatures down to -50 degrees. That's colder than anything FARGO has experienced in recorded history. But what if temperatures drop below -50? That's not meteorologically possible at this latitude. Our systems were designed based on climate data going back over a century. But what if the climate data is no longer accurate?" The city engineer looked at me with the expression engineers get when they think someone is questioning fundamental principles of physics. "Jim, you can't design infrastructure for impossible conditions. We built for the worst-case scenario based on all available data. But I knew that the worst-case scenario was about to be redefined by weather that had no historical precedent. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to prepare for a cold emergency that no one else believed was possible. I researched emergency heating systems, backup water distribution methods, and procedures for maintaining essential services during extreme weather events. But municipal infrastructure isn't something you can modify quickly or inexpensively. Water mains can't be moved deeper underground without massive construction projects. Power lines can't be replaced with cold-resistant materials without months of planning and millions of dollars in funding. The cold snap began on February 12th, with temperatures dropping to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but routine for North Dakota. The Weather Service predicted continued cold for several days, possibly reaching minus 35 degrees at its worst. But by February 14th, temperatures had dropped to minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and the city's infrastructure was showing signs of stress I'd never seen before. Water pressure was dropping in some neighborhoods as pipes began to freeze, despite being buried below the frost line. Natural gas pressure was fluctuating as the extreme cold affected distribution systems. On February 15th, Fargo recorded its lowest temperature in recorded history, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The city's water distribution system, designed for a frost line that no longer existed in these conditions, began failing catastrophically. Water mains 8 feet underground were freezing solid, then expanding and bursting, creating massive water breaks that couldn't be repaired because the ground was frozen too hard for excavation equipment to penetrate. That's when I knew my vision was becoming reality. I immediately activated all emergency protocols and called for assistance from state and federal emergency management agencies. But there's no emergency response adequate for the failure of an entire city's infrastructure during conditions that exceed all engineering specifications. By February 16th, temperatures had reached minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, within 3 degrees of what I'd seen in my vision. Fargo's water system collapsed completely. Frozen water mains were bursting throughout the city faster than repair crews could identify the breaks, much less fix them. Natural gas pressure dropped so low that heating systems in hundreds of buildings began shutting down automatically to prevent dangerous backflow conditions. The electrical grid began failing as metal transmission lines contracted beyond their flexibility limits. Power lines snapped under stresses that had never been calculated because engineers had never imagined such extreme conditions in North Dakota. Within 18 hours, 40% of Fargo had lost water service, 25% had lost natural gas heating, and 15% had lost electrical power. During the coldest weather in recorded history, the infrastructure that people depended on for survival was systematically failing. The emergency evacuation began on February 17th. But evacuating 125,000 people during minus 60-degree weather is logistically impossible. The buses that were supposed to transport residents to warming centers couldn't start because their diesel fuel had gelled in the extreme cold. The roads were impassable because even salt and sand were ineffective at those temperatures. People were trapped in houses without heat, without water, and in some cases without power, during weather that could kill in minutes. I spent 4 days working 18-hour shifts, trying to maintain whatever infrastructure was still functional. But I was fighting physics that had exceeded every assumption our city was built on. When water freezes solid 8 feet underground, when natural gas approaches its freezing point, when metal power lines snap like frozen rope, there's no amount of emergency planning that can maintain normal civic functions. The final casualty count from the Fargo freeze was 37 people, mostly elderly residents who died from hypothermia when their heating systems failed and they couldn't be evacuated in time. But the real casualty was the city itself. Repairing the infrastructure damage from 4 days of unprecedented cold took 8 months and cost $340 million. Hundreds of families were permanently displaced because their homes were uninhabitable after pipes burst and heating systems failed. The federal investigation concluded that Fargo's infrastructure failure was unavoidable given weather conditions that exceeded all historical precedents and engineering specifications. But that didn't change the fact that I had seen this disaster coming and been unable to prevent it. New federal guidelines now require cold weather infrastructure to be designed for temperatures 20 degrees below historical minimums. Building codes have been updated to require emergency heating systems in all residential buildings. Water distribution systems must now include backup distribution methods for extreme weather emergencies. But those changes came too late for the 37 people who died in Fargo, too late for the hundreds of families whose homes were destroyed, and too late for a city that learned the hard way that our assumptions about winter were based on a climate that no longer exists. Since the freeze, I've had 2 more visions of extreme weather events. Tornadoes in regions that had never experienced them, and ice storms that would bring down power grids across the entire upper Midwest. Each time I've tried to warn the appropriate authorities. Each time I've been told that such events are not meteorologically possible in our region. But I've learned that meteorologically possible has become meaningless in an era of climate change. The weather we're getting bears no resemblance to the weather our infrastructure was designed for, and the gap between those two realities is measured in human lives. I continue to work in municipal utilities, but now I spend as much time planning for impossible weather as I do maintaining routine infrastructure. Because I know that in our new climate reality, impossible is just another word for next winter. The most devastating part of my experience isn't that I failed to prevent those 37 deaths. It's that I knew exactly what was going to happen and found myself trapped in systems that couldn't adapt quickly enough to protect people who had trusted those systems their entire lives. Sometimes having a premonition isn't about being able to change the future. Sometimes it's about bearing witness to the moment when the world we thought we lived in proves to be a dangerous illusion. Have you ever known that your community's infrastructure was inadequate for disasters that everyone insisted were impossible? Have you ever watched systems fail in ways that killed people who had no choice but to trust those systems for survival? 2. Professionals who understood their local climates better than almost anyone, yet found themselves witnessing weather disasters that exceeded every assumption their communities had made about what was possible. Dr. Elena Rossi watched elderly patients die from heat that wasn't supposed to exist in northern Italy. James McKenzie saw his city's infrastructure collapse during cold that had never been recorded in North Dakota. What strikes me most about these accounts is how both individuals possessed deep expertise in their respective areas. Elena understood elderly care and heat-related medical emergencies. James knew cold weather infrastructure and municipal utilities better than perhaps anyone in Fargo. Yet both found their expertise useless when confronted with weather conditions that fell outside every historical precedent their systems were based on. Both cases reveal a terrifying truth about our relationship with climate. We've built our entire civilization based on assumptions about weather patterns that may no longer be valid. During my follow-up interviews, I discovered that both Elena and James experienced profound changes in how they approach their professional responsibilities. Elena described developing an obsession with emergency preparedness that her colleagues find excessive, but she considers essential. James mentioned that he now designs systems for weather conditions that have never occurred, despite resistance from engineers and budget officials who consider such preparations wasteful. Perhaps this is what premonitions represent in the age of climate change. Early warning systems for environmental conditions that our civilization isn't prepared to handle, even when those conditions become scientifically inevitable. But there's a more disturbing aspect to both stories. In each case, the premonition wasn't just about isolated weather events, but about the systematic failure of infrastructure that millions of people depend on for survival. Elena's vision revealed that heat emergencies don't just kill individuals. They overwhelm entire healthcare systems during the moments when those systems are most needed. James's foresight showed that extreme cold doesn't just create uncomfortable conditions, it can destroy the technological foundations that make modern urban life possible. This suggests that climate-related premonitions may be detecting not just weather events, but civilization-level vulnerabilities that we haven't acknowledged or prepared for. 6 months after these interviews, I researched other cases of premonitions related to extreme weather events. I found accounts of individuals who foresaw hurricanes reaching unprecedented intensities, floods that exceeded all engineering projections, and droughts that would persist far longer than agricultural systems could survive. In every case, the premonitions proved accurate, and in every case, individuals who experienced them found themselves powerless to prevent disasters that occurred precisely because our infrastructure and emergency systems were designed for climate conditions that no longer exist. This pattern suggests something deeply troubling about our collective preparation for climate change. We're not just facing more severe weather. We're facing weather that exceeds the fundamental assumptions our civilization is built on. The most heartbreaking discovery in my research was how both Elena and James's experiences led to policy changes that came too late to save the lives that had already been lost. Elena's warnings about heat vulnerability resulted in new cooling requirements for elder care facilities. James's insights about cold weather infrastructure led to updated building codes for extreme weather. In both cases, the premonitions were accurate enough to guide effective policy responses, but the systems that needed to change couldn't adapt quickly enough to prevent the disasters those same premonitions had foreseen. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of both stories is how they reveal the mathematical precision with which infrastructure failures translate into human casualties. Elena could predict almost exactly which patients would die based on the relationship between temperature and elderly physiology. James could calculate which neighborhoods would lose services based on the engineering tolerances of water and power systems. This suggests that climate-related premonitions may operate not as supernatural phenomena, but as enhanced pattern recognition that allows some individuals to perceive the inevitable consequences of physical systems operating beyond their design parameters. The most unsettling conclusion from both accounts is that they represent not isolated disasters, but previews of the new normal. Elena's heat dome was unprecedented for Milan, but temperatures that extreme are now predicted to occur regularly throughout southern Europe. James's freeze was impossible for North Dakota, but climate instability is expected to produce similar Arctic intrusions throughout the northern United States. Both individuals experienced premonitions of disasters that were shocking when they occurred, but that will likely seem routine within a decade. This raises fundamental questions about how we prepare for a climate future that bears no resemblance to the climate past our infrastructure was designed for. Are we still building for the weather we remember rather than the weather we should expect? Have you ever known that your community wasn't prepared for weather disasters that officials insisted were impossible? Have you ever watched climate systems fail in ways that killed people who had no choice but to trust those systems for their survival?